December 19th, 1944, near Honsveld, Belgium. The wind cut like a blade through the forest. Snow fell silently over the wreckage of burned-out tanks and broken pines, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and for the men of one small German platoon, it already felt like the end of the world. Inside a half-frozen barn, 20 soldiers sat close together, their breath turning to mist in the air. Among them was Obergefreiter Karl Weiss, 24 years old, his face thin and his hands cracked from the cold. From the inside pocket of his uniform, he pulled a folded piece of paper, creased and soft from being read too many times. The letter was from his wife, Liesel, written weeks earlier in a small apartment in Stuttgart. The words were careful, filled with warmth that seemed to belong to another universe. "My dearest Karl," she had written, "the baby's first tooth has come through. I keep the stove burning, though the nights feel colder without you." Karl read it again, tracing each line with his eyes, as if to remind himself that somewhere, far beyond the front lines, life still existed. For a few seconds, the war vanished. The cold didn't matter. The noise outside was just wind. In his mind, he could almost hear the creak of their wooden floor back home, the smell of bread baking, the sound of her laugh. He folded the letter slowly, like a prayer, and tucked it back into his pocket, the safest place he knew. Outside, the company commander shouted orders. They were to move before dawn. The radio report said the Americans were retreating, but none of the men believed it. They could feel the front closing in from all sides. Their maps were outdated, their supplies almost gone. Karl looked toward the door where snowflakes blew in through the cracks. His breath hung in the air like smoke. He thought of the words his captain had said the night before. "Victory is close, boys. Hold the line." But victory didn't feel close. It felt like a story someone told to make the waiting easier. That night, he slept with the letter against his chest, as if it could keep his heart from freezing. He didn't know it yet, but that single piece of paper, written with love, carried through fear and meant to bring him hope, would soon decide the fate of every man in that barn. If this story already gives you chills, stay with me. What that letter caused next would echo far beyond the battlefield. Morning came grey and bitter. The sky hung low, heavy with snow that refused to stop falling. Karl and his platoon trudged through the forest, their boots sinking into the frozen mud. Every step cracked the ice beneath them. Their breath came out in small clouds that instantly vanished into the cold. The radio, slung over a young soldier's back, crackled with the voice of a German announcer. The man's tone was calm, confident, almost cheerful. "Our glorious forces have pushed the Americans back. Victory is near," he declared. The men listened in silence. None of them smiled. They had seen too many victories end in retreat. Karl adjusted the strap of his rifle and glanced at the others. He could see it in their faces, the disbelief, the quiet exhaustion. The propaganda coming from Berlin sounded like it was describing another war entirely. Here, there were no triumphant marches or proud flags, only hunger, fear, and the endless white of the Ardennes. A few meters ahead, Sergeant Weber muttered something about the Americans having better coats. The men laughed softly, the kind of laughter that wasn't about humor, but survival. It was all they had left. By noon, they reached a crossroads where the forest opened to a stretch of open ground. The captain ordered them to take cover in a ditch and wait for reconnaissance. Karl sat against a tree, rubbing his hands together for warmth. His fingers brushed the edge of Liesel's letter again. He pulled it out and read it silently, letting the words distract him from the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. Around him, men whispered about going home. Some still believed that if they held out long enough, they'd return to their families before the new year. Others said nothing, staring blankly at the snow, as if trying to remember what peace even looked like. A distant boom rolled across the hills. Artillery. The ground trembled beneath them. The captain told everyone to stay low. It wasn't directed at them, not yet. Carl tucked the letter back into his pocket and tightened his scarf. That evening, as darkness settled in, they found shelter in an abandoned farmhouse. Someone lit a small fire in the corner, careful to keep the smoke low. The radio played again, a German choir singing softly through the static. It sounded almost holy, out of place amid the ruin. Carl sat near the embers, staring into the flames. He thought about Liesel's handwriting, about the way she always ended her letters with the same words, "Come back to me." He whispered them under his breath, as if saying them out loud could make them real. What none of them knew was that outside, the American lines were closer than they thought. Somewhere in the dark woods beyond that farmhouse, another patrol was moving, tired, cold, and just as lost. The war was tightening its grip around both sides, pulling them toward each other like a cruel magnet. And in the middle of it all, resting quietly against Carl's heart, was the letter that would soon change everything. If you've ever wondered how something so small could alter the course of so many lives, stay with me, because what happens next turns a simple act of love into one of the most tragic misunderstandings of the entire war. The storm grew worse overnight. By morning, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The forest had turned into a maze of white and silence, broken only by the groan of distant artillery and the occasional shout of a commander trying to keep his men together. Carl marched near the rear of the column, boots soaked through, rifle heavy in his hands. He had stopped feeling his fingers hours ago. Every breath burned his lungs. The road ahead was buried beneath the snow, and even the compass seemed to falter. They were ordered to cross a ridge and set up a temporary observation post overlooking the valley. The climb was slow, each step slipping on ice. Carl stumbled once, catching himself with his rifle, his heart pounding. A small tear appeared near the pocket of his uniform where the letter was kept. He didn't notice. By midday, the wind became so strong they could barely hear each other. Sergeant Weber shouted for them to move faster, but his voice was lost in the howl. Carl reached for his map, his gloves stiff with frost, and at that moment, the letter slipped from his pocket. It fluttered once, twice, then disappeared into the snow behind him. He didn't see it fall. The platoon pushed forward another kilometer before they finally stopped for rest. They took shelter in a small hollow beneath a cluster of pines, the snow forming walls around them. Carl reached into his pocket to read the letter again, something to remind him he was still human. His hand found nothing. He froze, then checked again. The panic rose like a wave in his chest. He searched the ground, his pack, his coat, nothing. The letter was gone. Weber noticed his shaking hands. "What is it?" he asked. "My letter," Carl muttered. "It's gone." Weber sighed, brushing snow from his helmet. "You'll see her again, Weiss. Forget the letter." But Carl couldn't. It wasn't just paper. It was his proof that he was still a man, not just a number in a frozen army. That night, while the others slept, he thought of going back to look for it. But the cold outside was unforgiving, and the thought of wandering alone in the dark terrified him more than anything. He stayed where he was, eyes open, haunted by the image of that piece of paper lying somewhere out there in the snow. The next morning, a group of American soldiers moved cautiously through that same ridge. They were part of an intelligence unit scanning for enemy movements. Private James Hollis, 21 and exhausted, noticed something half buried near a fallen branch. He picked it up, a letter sealed with dirt and frozen at the edges. The handwriting was neat, careful, foreign. He brushed the snow away and called for his lieutenant. They brought it back to camp. Inside the tent, a field interpreter unfolded the soggy paper and began to read aloud. His German was limited, learned from school years before. He caught words here and there. "Movement, North Ridge, tonight," his voice tightened. "It could be enemy orders," he said. "They're planning something near the northern ridge." The lieutenant frowned, studying the page. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir." It mentions position and North Hill. It could be coordinates. What he didn't realize was that the letter said something entirely different. The word he thought was position actually meant posture, a mother describing her baby learning to stand. The North Ridge was a reference to the view from her kitchen window, but the mistake was made. Orders went out that night for artillery to shell the ridge before dawn. Back in the forest, Carl and his men were still there, exhausted, hungry, unaware that their own fate was already sealed by a misunderstanding born from love. When the first shells began to fall, Carl thought it was just the usual distant thunder. But then the ground erupted around them. Trees snapped, snow turned to smoke. The men scattered, shouting through the chaos, trying to find cover. And amid the confusion, Carl realized the ridge being bombarded was the same one where he had dropped his letter, the letter that had found its way into enemy hands, the letter that had doomed them all. If this story has your heart tightening already, keep listening, because the real tragedy isn't what happened next. It's what Carl discovered afterward, when everything had already been lost. When the shelling finally stopped, the forest was unrecognizable. The snow that had once been pure white was now a landscape of broken trees, smoking craters, and silence so deep it rang in the ears. The few who had survived the bombardment crawled through the wreckage, their breath trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. Carl Weiss lay half-buried beneath a collapsed branch. His coat was torn, his helmet gone. He tried to move and felt a stabbing pain in his side. The air smelled of earth and gunpowder, heavy and sharp. He called out for Sergeant Weber, but only the wind answered. Hours passed before the world seemed to exist again. The snow began to fall softly once more, covering the wreckage like a blanket, as if nature itself wanted to hide what had happened. Carl managed to stand, staggering between the shattered pines, whispering names under his breath. Weber, Kraus, Meyer. No one replied. By nightfall, he found what was left of their camp. Burned maps, a bent rifle, the blackened outline of their radio. The letter was gone, of course, but among the ashes, a piece of paper fluttered weakly in the wind. He knelt down and picked it up. It was half-burned, the ink smeared and edges singed. He could still make out a few words in Liesel's handwriting. The baby. Smile. Come home. His hands trembled. For a moment, everything inside him went quiet. There was no anger, no sorrow, just the crushing understanding that this somehow was how it had to end. The next morning, an American patrol found him wandering through the snow, dazed and silent. He didn't resist when they took his rifle. He didn't speak when they asked his name. They assumed he was in shock. In truth, he was somewhere far away, standing once again in his kitchen in Stuttgart, hearing Liesel laugh, seeing the soft light through the window over the North Ridge she had written about. As the days turned into weeks, Carl sat in a prisoner of war camp, staring at the horizon. He learned, through scattered conversation and rumor, that the Americans had shelled the ridge after intercepting enemy correspondence. That phrase echoed in his head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He understood then what had happened. The letter had been found. The words had been mistaken, and his entire platoon had paid for it. That night, he wrote another letter. Not to Liesel, but to no one in particular. He didn't have paper, so he used the back of a captured ration form. His handwriting was slow, each line heavy. If anyone finds this, he wrote, tell her that the war wasn't lost because of enemies. It was lost because we stopped hearing each other. Because love became something suspicious and words turned into weapons. He folded it and kept it in his pocket. He never sent it. Years later, when the war finally ended, Carl returned to Stuttgart. The city was a skeleton of what it once was, half in ruins, half still alive. He found Liesel waiting by what remained of their home. She was holding their son, now old enough to walk. She asked him what had happened at the front, and he told her only one thing. "That letter you wrote me," he said softly, "it reached the wrong people." She didn't understand what he meant, and maybe it was better that way. If this story has moved you so far, don't stop here. The final part reveals what Carl did with the truth, and the haunting reflection that still echoes through history today. Years passed, and the war became a ghost that Europe tried to forget. Streets were rebuilt, flags changed, and memories faded into photographs left in drawers. But for Carl Weiss, the echo of that winter never truly stopped. It lived in the quiet moments, in the way he hesitated before opening a letter, in the way he looked toward the hills whenever snow began to fall. He found work rebuilding train stations, his hands rough and scarred, his face older than his years. Liesel never asked again about what had happened in Belgium. She could see in his eyes that some truths were too heavy to be spoken aloud. Sometimes, late at night, Carl would take out the burned fragment of her letter, the only piece he had left. The words were barely legible, but he knew them by heart. "Come home." He would hold it close, and for a moment, it was as if time folded in on itself. The frozen forest, the broken men, the sound of shells, all of it compressed into a single heartbeat of silence. He never blamed the Americans. He never cursed the translator. Deep down, he knew that war was full of people trying to understand each other through fear and noise, and failing. The tragedy wasn't in the mistake itself, but in how easy it was for love to be mistaken for strategy, for tenderness to be read as threat. As an old man, Carl sometimes walked to the nearby river and watched the water move. "That's all history is," he once told his son. "A river of words flowing between people who stopped listening." The boy didn't fully understand, but he remembered. In the end, the lost letter became more than a memory. It was a warning, a quiet testament to how fragile truth can be when filtered through fear. A few pages of love turned into coordinates of destruction. A mother's words about her child became an order for death. And still, Carl kept that burned fragment until his last day. When he passed away, Liesel found it folded neatly inside his coat. She read the few words that remained: "Baby, smile, home," and finally understood why he had never been able to talk about the war. He had carried the weight of misunderstanding longer than any weapon. It wasn't hatred that had destroyed his platoon. It wasn't even fate. It was something far simpler. The space between one language and another, one heart and another, one truth and its translation. He had written about love. They had read it as war. And in that misunderstanding lay the quiet tragedy of a world that had forgotten how to listen. So what do you think? Was it destiny or just the cruel logic of war, where even love, when misread, can turn fatal?